So, Chris, we know that there are a huge number of fears, fascinations, and sort of curiosities around cold calling and whether or not it's relevant and effective today. One of my favorite stats that I've listened into recently is this: 86% of execs hate getting a cold call, 84% of execs love getting a good sales call. So there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. I'm just going to jump straight in. Chris, range of fears and fascinations associated with using the phone effectively. The data tells us that it takes about 4 to 5% dial to connect rate to actually acquire a conversation with a named prospect in your market. When you look at the data, what does this mean for 98% of salespeople around the world who are desperate to do better in this channel in both terms of sunk time and effort versus actual business results?
Well, I mean, it's brutal, right? I mean, conversations are the breathing, they're the oxygen of sales. And if you're not getting enough of them, you're starving. Imagine, Gerry, you've been known to play a little bit of rugby, right?
It's happened.
Yeah, once or twice. Imagine if you could ask the other team to just change one thing, put on a piece of gear that only allowed them to breathe once every 90 seconds. Now, that's what it's like for salespeople. They only get to have a conversation with somebody they want to talk to once every 90 minutes. And from a personal standpoint, professional standpoint, it's kind of maddening, really, to spend all that time. I'm looking at your stats from the last few days. And this month, you've had 29 conversations. You're not an SDR, right? I think you're you're actually our country director. You're our continent director, right over there. And yet you've managed to have 29 conversations using the connect and sell weapon. If you had to do that manually, that took you 7 hours and 14 minutes. If you'd had to do that manually, that would have been 43 hours spread over the 4 days that you've gotten to work this month so far. Would you have done it?
No.
It's simple. It's simple. You wouldn't have had the conversations and you would have been at a disadvantage yourself with regard to quota. But the big deal is, this conference is about a lot of things, but one thing it's about is succeeding, which means also surviving as a SaaS company. And if your team isn't having enough conversations, you better hope the other guys aren't. It's as simple as that. And, it's a competitive world out there. And first to converse changes everything. When you have a conversation with somebody, you can send them an email, they'll open it. You can do what Morgan said. You can send them a video, they'll actually watch the darn thing. All sorts of worlds open up from a conversation, including the immediate trust of a skilled conversation, a well-handled conversation.
So interesting. So the resource base is then to the left, the right of the conversation, not the left. Fascinating. So Chris, we often talk about the value of follow-up calls. It seems to be a neglected art in today's modern selling world, and it's undercoached to a lot of sales teams that we have the privilege of working with. Could you tell us a bit more about follow-up call performance and why leaders should index it and care deeply about good, high quality, consistent, and repeatable follow-up with your market?
Yeah, there's two big things about follow-ups that are interesting. One is if you've spoken with somebody before, they actually go into a magic cohort, people who answer the phone. That's pretty good. So your numbers automatically get better when you call people that you've spoken with before. The psychology is radically different. They've heard your voice. You can refer back to the previous conversation, so you don't have to either use a script or worse, get that advanced degree from MSU, make stuff up, which a lot of reps seem to kind of like to do. And then competitively, you change the landscape for a simple reason. If you consider in B2B, it's about a 3-year cycle before somebody replaces a solution. So if you take those 3 years, cut it up into 12 quarters that it is, it's about, I'll say roughly 8.5% of your market is in market right now under ideal conditions. So if you speak to somebody who's a perfect prospect, but the timing's not good, you better follow up about a quarter later, or you have worked for your competitor. You've alerted the prospect to the opportunity to solve a problem, and then you've left the field to your competitor so that they can talk instead of you.
That's interesting. So what we're saying there is that there's compound value inherent in follow-up inventory, that follow-up inventory is an easier path to acquiring a meeting because you've got a timing signal, a precision signal about whether or not that person's primed, ripe, and ready to have another conversation with you in the future sometime. Is that a sort of summary of what we're trying to say here?
Yeah, absolutely. If you think about it in terms of markets, you can dominate a market by talking to everybody in that market once a quarter, as long as you've got the goods and the will. So failure to do that, talking to them once, basically is just giving up. It's giving up to the competition.
That's really fascinating. So, Chris, these are short order formats. So I've only got one last real question for you. Again, this is around a very practical problem that a lot of our customers talk about. One thing that we strongly recommend to go-to-market teams with growth imperatives is that reps, salespeople, regardless of their job role, should not be doing their own list work. We often hear that list work and research has to be the domain of your entry-level sales team, often because of their proximity to the market. So what do we see as evidence that the best performing companies don't let their salespeople build their own lists, and why do we take such a strong position on that?
Well, there's two factors when it comes to lists. One is just where's the time being spent? So if you're spending your time building lists, you're not spending your time talking to people. It's as simple as that. Well, you're building a list with me on the list. I'm not getting any information from you. And for all you know, you're never going to speak with me. So building lists is something that is time consuming. It takes time away from sales. Secondly, and this is a really big deal, great salespeople are talkers and listeners. They do a really good job of listening for problems and figuring out whether it makes sense to continue the conversation, go down the road. Really good talker listeners are very rarely great data analysts. They get frustrated, it's slow, and it's painful for them to deal with data. There are great people out there who know how to deal with data, and they do it comfortably. And quite frankly, there's a third factor. As a CEO, I'll throw this out there, which is I'm not going to turn over the strategy of the company to somebody I hired 4 weeks ago. And the strategy of our company, as with every company, is represented in its market, and the market is a list. So just basically saying, hey, go get them, doesn't make a lot of sense. It's worth centralizing and making sure that the list makes sense for your market, and then taking that off the rep's plate so that they can do what they're great at, which is talking, listening, setting meetings, creating opportunities.
So I think my key takeaway there, Chris, is that the list is your strategy, and CEOs and the very tops of organizations should be responsible for determining the structure and the composition of the list because they own the strategy. I just want to be absolutely clear that that's the key message that we're trying to bring to value here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, your go-to-market strategy assumes that you've got a thing called a market, and a market must always be reduced to a list. Jeffrey Moore told me this years ago. I hate to say how many years ago, but I think it was in 1994. And, he's the author of Crossing the Chasm. I asked him, what do we all get wrong, all of us entrepreneurs? He said, you think a description of a market is a market. It's not a market. A market is always defined as a list of companies. And if you sell one of them, everybody else on that list becomes cheaper and lower risk to sell to. So that's the definition of a market. If you don't reduce it to a list, you're not in control of your strategy.
That's interesting. Just as a sort of sidebar question then, as a leader and somebody that's been around go-to-market since time dot, do you feel that leaders have a responsibility to move friction out of the path of their people as their number one priority so that they can just get on with their job? Is that what the sales tech space is fundamentally about?
Yeah, I mean, that's true of leadership everywhere. I used to be in the manufacturing world. It doesn't make any difference whether it's manufacturing or sales. You're always going through the same cycle as a leader. You're looking for the bottleneck where the friction is. You're trying to understand it. You're trying to figure out how to reduce the cycle time of that bottleneck or increase the quality of the output. And you're doing that in a way that allows your people to do what they do uniquely well, whatever that is. Now, that human thing. So that's why we automate. We automate to enhance the human factor and get the friction out of the way. And that's pretty much all technology should do. And you got to get something measurable out of it. And it can't be at the end. It can't be like, oh, our revenue went up. So for us, for instance, we look first at conversations. Are you getting more conversations? You had 29 conversations in the last 4 days. I'm reasonably pleased. You're a big time AE. You have 29 conversations and set 5 meetings. I'm pretty good, right? So that's important. Why, how'd that happen? Some friction was taken out for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the sort of fears and fascinations around the tech stack at the moment is, will it replace humans? And I think what I'm hearing from us in this conversation today and throughout the entire conversation for SaaS Growth is that actually we're supplementing your super bright, awesome, capable people, and we're just tooling them up with the right weapons to be able to go to market effectively for your marketplace. Think about Iron Man. He was the only person in the Avengers who was not superhuman. But he built himself a suit. He augmented his capabilities and his intellect with machinery, and he went and dominated the Avengers as a concept, right? Saved planets. So I think that if people took that mindset, that could be quite an interesting approach.